The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, unveiling a historic betrayal. Welcome to a deep dive into one of the most unsettling chapters in American history. Today, we're exploring the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, a study that ran for 40 years, operated under government oversight, and exploited the lives of hundreds of African American men in the name of science. This video dissects the experiment's origins, ethical breakdowns, and lasting consequences, shining a light on how systemic racism and government negligence allowed such a catastrophic failure to unfold. To understand the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, we must first consider the early 20th century social and medical landscape. It was the 1930s, during the height of the Great Depression, and African American communities in the rural South lived under severe socioeconomic hardship. In this period of racial segregation and systemic discrimination, African Americans had little access to education, healthcare, or justice. Amid this backdrop, syphilis was a widespread public health issue in the United States. It disproportionately affected African American communities, primarily due to poor healthcare infrastructure and lack of education. Deemed a pressing concern, the U.S. Public Health Service, USPHS, initiated what would come to be known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study in 1932. The study targeted a vulnerable group, or African American men, mostly sharecroppers, from Macomb County, Alabama. The USPHS recruited 600 men, of which 399 had syphilis and 201 served as a control group. Participants were promised free health care, meals, and burial insurance in exchange for their involvement. However, these promises, much like the study's motives, were shrouded in deception. The men were misled into believing they were being treated for bad blood, a vague term commonly used at the time to describe a range of illnesses, including syphilis. The reality was far more sinister. The healthcare services they were offered were, in fact, thinly veiled observational studies. Doctors had no intention of treating the disease, but sought to document its natural progression in the human body. In essence, the USPHS exploited these men's socioeconomic vulnerabilities, dangling the promise of medical care in exchange for their unknowing participation in what would become a horrific breach of medical ethics. Crucially, this was not the work of rogue scientists operating outside the law. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was sanctioned and conducted by the U.S. government, specifically under the auspices of the Public Health Service. Government funds were allocated to this project, and officials at various levels were complicit in maintaining its continuation. Local authorities, including Black community leaders and doctors, were sometimes brought on board to encourage participation, a tactic designed to build trust. Yet behind closed doors, this trust was systematically and intentionally exploited. The most chilling aspect of the government's involvement became evident when penicillin was discovered in the 1940s as an effective cure for syphilis. Did the USPHS then treat the men in the study? No. In fact, they actively withheld treatment to preserve the scientific integrity of the study. This was not negligence. It was a deliberate decision that cost lives. Ethically, the Tuskegee experiment represents a complete collapse of morality and medical standards. Researchers prioritized their scientific goals over basic human rights and the well-being of their patients. At no point during the study's 40-year run were participants given informed consent, partly because they were never fully told the purpose of the study. The lack of transparency and the intentional withholding of treatment transcend the bounds of ethical science, even by the less stringent standards of the time. This experiment not only violated medical ethics, but also preempted the call for establishing global guidelines like the Nuremberg Code, which would later emerge in response to human rights abuses during World War II. The question we must ask is, how was this able to continue so long without public outcry? The answer lies in the intersection of race, class, and power. The men in Tuskegee were not seen as equals. They were viewed as test subjects. Racism was the foundation upon which this experiment was justified and perpetuated. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment might have carried on indefinitely if not for whistleblowers who brought its horrors to light in 1972. Peter Buxton, a public health employee, leaked information about the study to journalists, leading to a revelatory expose by the Associated Press. The nation was shocked. For the first time, the public faced the undeniable truth. Their government had sanctioned a medical experiment that not only exploited its participants, but actively harmed them. The fallout was immediate and severe. Public trust in healthcare and government institutions, particularly among African American communities, was shattered. In the wake of the scandal, the U.S. government faced immense pressure to respond. Lawsuits followed, and in 1974, survivors received financial compensation as part of a legal settlement. The government also set up the Tuskegee Health Benefit Program, which provided free medical and burial services for surviving participants and their families. It wasn't until 1997, however, minus 25 years after the experiment's closure, that President Bill Clinton issued a formal public apology. Flanked by surviving participants, Clinton admitted the government's failure and acknowledged the immense harm caused. But despite the apology, the damage was done. The mistrust seeded by Tuskegee would cast a long shadow over American healthcare. To this day, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment shapes how marginalized communities perceive healthcare in the United States. For African Americans, who were already subjected to systemic racism, Tuskegee affirmed long-standing fears about government and medical institutions. It became a symbol of betrayal, a harrowing reminder that those in power could exploit the vulnerable without accountability. Many African Americans cite Tuskegee as a reason for their skepticism toward modern medical systems, from vaccinations to organ donation programs. Whether or not these fears are justified in every context, the emotional legacy of Tuskegee fuels modern-day conspiracy theories, further widening the gap between vulnerable populations and essential healthcare initiatives. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment wasn't just a failure. It became a turning point that ushered in crucial reforms aimed at preventing similar abuses in the future. The most notable reform was the establishment of ethical guidelines for medical research on humans. In 1979, the Belmont Report was published, outlining principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice in research. Institutional review boards, IRBs, were also established, mandating that research proposals undergo rigorous ethical scrutiny before approval. While these reforms have improved protections, the legacy of Tuskegee reminds us that safeguards are only as effective as the systems enforcing them. The harm caused by Tuskegee cannot be undone, but it continues to serve as a case study in the importance of vigilance and accountability. Analyzing the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment reveals more than just ethical lapses. It uncovers deeply entrenched systemic racism embedded in American society. At its core, the study was built on racist ideologies that dehumanize African Americans, treating them as expendable in the pursuit of medical knowledge. This wasn't incidental, it was structural. It reflected a broader system that consistently devalued Black lives while using the veneer of public welfare as justification. The Tuskegee study wasn't an isolated incident. It was a manifestation of systemic inequality fueled by race and class divides. Even as we reflect on the past, we must address the present. The disparities in access to healthcare and racial representation in medical fields continue to plague modern systems. Acknowledging these injustices is critical to ensuring history does not repeat itself. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment forces us to confront the gap between ethical ideals and real-world practice. Looking back, we see a painful lesson in what happens when science veers away from ethics and serves power rather than people. There are several key takeaways. Medical consent is sacred. Consent without informed understanding is no consent at all. Science needs oversight. Unchecked power in research can allow tragedy to persist. Representation matters. Marginalized communities must be active participants in creating and safeguarding policies that affect them. Representation matters. Marginalized communities must be active participants in creating and safeguarding policies that affect them. Representation matters. Marginalized communities must be active participants in creating and safeguarding policies that affect them. The events in Tuskegee remind us why history should not be ignored but studied and remembered. It's a warning. Without scrutiny, institutional power can easily lead to systematic harm. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment wasn't just a failure of medical ethics, it was a profound betrayal of trust. It left scars on the individuals involved, the African American community, and public perception of institutions. It's a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the cost of ignoring human rights in the name of progress. As we remember this history, we should do so with the intention of learning from it. The legacy of Tuskegee is not just a story of tragedy, it is a call to action. Let us honor the victims by demanding accountability, transparency, and justice in every field that touches human lives. Thank you for watching this educational reflection.